This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. So good to have you listening in, and it's good to have you talking in, Richard.
Thanks. Well, thanks.
This week we want to focus in on something that we've touched on before. Actually, I was looking back on the episodes. We talked about leaving a legacy about 2 years ago, almost.
Yeah.
Or actually a little past 2 years.
Yeah.
I think it was episode in the 40s. If you can go back that far and listen, it's crazy that we've been at this long. I know.
Period of our podcast.
Yeah. So, but today we want to look at this in a slightly different context, or maybe just narrow the context of this. And thinking about how we as leaders leave a godly legacy in our family.
Yeah. And Sam, that is such a big issue for so many people today, especially for those of you that might be listening who are baby boomers. There's and if you've had a millennial child, as I did, millennials, of course, are leaving the church in droves these days, and the younger generations, the Gen Z and so on, are just not that interested in large part. And so everywhere I go, there are people coming up to me just heartbroken because their kids don't want to go to church, or they've grown up and they've stopped going now that they're adults. And they're brokenhearted to say, what do you have to do to get your kids to hold on to God with this culture that seems to be trying to pry them away all the time?
Yeah. Well, and that is the question. And so many people, I think, listening will likely be successful in their career and perhaps even in their leadership positions, wherever they may be. But oftentimes, and I know you've come across this frequently, is that people who are successful in business are not always successful at home with their own kids. And so maybe just walk us through some things that we can take away that would be helpful.
Sure. And, one or two just sort of clarifiers maybe here at the outset. And one is, some of our listeners may not have kids, and so that may not be an issue for you. But I do feel like every person, certainly every leader, wants to hope that their leadership in some way outlasted them.
Yeah.
Even if you worked you led a company for 10 years and then you moved on, you like to think that at least for a couple of years afterward, what you did, how you led, stayed somehow in the culture. It outlasted you. And so this is really about how do you lead in such a way that, it's been said, the illustration's been given of a bucket of water, and you put your fist in the water, in the bucket, and then you yank your fist out of the water. And about that quickly, of course, the water fills in the space that your hand was in.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have said, well, that's about how long it takes for your influence to be gone when you leave a place. The next guy comes in, changes everything, how it's done, the culture adjusts, and they move on, and it's as if you were never there. And that's kind of heartbreaking, especially if you lead with all of your heart and you really want to make a place better and you've worked hard to improve things. You want to think that at least for some time afterward, that there's a difference. And I've been in organizations that the founder has been dead for years, and yet they still revere him and his or her and their influence, and they still know that the founder wouldn't want that to be done that way or this way. Certainly, that's kind of how we do things at Blackaby Ministries. My dad is not actively leading anymore, but I know him well enough to know what he would never want us to do.
Yeah.
And the way he would want to be represented and so on. And so he still exerts an enormous influence on how we do things, even though he's not in the office every day anymore. So how do you do that? But particularly with your kids. So this applies whether you're just a leader at work, but certainly I want to zero in today on kids And I would also just say that there's no foolproof way, because of course God's given every child free will, and so you may have done everything perfectly. You may
much
have,
to the dismay of parents across the land.
so for instance, in my life at this point, I would say, as of this broadcast, my kids are doing well, walking with the Lord, serving Him, as are their spouses. But you might have done everything just like I did, and yet your kids might have made different choices. So I don't want to say if you just do things like I did, then
there's
everything
no
will work
formula.
out. Right, because there is that nebulous kind of aspect of free will in every child, and they have different experiences. They go to different schools, have different friends, different stimuli that come at them, and so every child's going to have their own journey. So I never present this to say, well, if you just were a perfect parent like me, then you would have a great legacy too, because my kids and your kids haven't necessarily faced the same things. They're not wired the same way. So I feel like I need to at least say that at the outset. Now, if you trace the Blackaby family tree, you can go back quite a ways. In fact, as far back as we can trace, we can find Blackaby ministers in our family tree.
We tracked down some of those too.
Yeah, we did. So back in around the 1850s or so, there were 3 Blackaby brothers that all went to Spurgeon's College. I think they probably were all there at the same time. Frederick, I believe, might have been the oldest, and he went on to become a pastor of a church, several churches in England over the years. So he studied under Charles Spurgeon himself. And you and I actually went to one of the churches he pastored in Stow-on-the-Wold. What was that, like a 40-minute or so, 45-minute drive outside of Oxford, England?
Yeah.
And
we actually did a little video. You can see the church and you talk a little bit about that. You can find that on our Blackaby YouTube channel under the Blackaby, the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast playlist. You can find that video.
Yeah, and I think that church was originally founded in like the 1600s.
Yeah.
And so one of the oldest Baptist churches in the world, I think. And he pastored there for a while. It's still a Baptist church. He had a younger brother that pastored and was a beloved, saintly minister, and he died prematurely, but was a godly pastor as well. And then the third brother went to Spurgeon's College and was deeply impacted by him, but ultimately felt led to go into business. And so he had a bakery, was a Christian baker, and that man had some sons, and one of those sons was my grandfather, Gerald Blackaby. And he also, I guess, following the family tradition, he had 2 uncles that were ministers, and then his dad was a Christian businessman. So he actually felt called to be a pastor. But his pastor at the time had said to my grandfather, "Oh, you're way too talented of a young man to waste your life in ministry. He should go into business." So he heeded his pastor's bad counsel and went into banking. But he really demonstrated that he was called to ministry all of his life. So everywhere he'd go, he would end up planting churches. And so just like his uncles, he planted churches, and then he would pastor those churches until he got them up to a size where he could call a full-time pastor to come in. And so he did that. And so my dad grew up with that kind of father who planted churches, was very evangelistic, constantly witnessing at work and leading people to Christ. And then, of course, my dad was deeply impacted by him. And at one point, my dad was in a youth meeting, and they called out the call. They challenged people to surrender to God's call in their life. And my dad went forward to commit his life to surrender to whatever God had for him. And my grandfather, who was a godly layman, highly respected, was there, and he was actually one of the counselors. And my father actually went forward and came up to his own dad and said, basically, God's calling me into ministry. And my grandfather said to my dad, "Well, Henry, I feel like God called me into ministry too, and I missed it. I didn't. I received bad counsel, and I didn't do it. And he said, I really want to encourage you to go with God, do what I failed to do. And so my dad did, of course. And God has used my dad powerfully. And my dad had 5 children. He had 4 sons and then a daughter. And all 5 of those kids went into full-time Christian ministry as well. The 4 boys all ended up with doctor's degrees in ministry. My sister was a missionary in Germany for a number of years with her husband. And so my dad had all 5 of his kids ended up in ministry. And now my dad's got 14 grandkids, and all 14 are Christians. All 14 are in church. They're walking with the Lord, have embraced the faith. 14 out of 14 at this point. And of course, some of them are still a bit younger ones. The youngest one's still in high school. But many are in college. Several are already one at least is already a pastor, and others are in ministry as well. And of course, I've got 3 kids, and all 3 of my kids have been to seminary and are serving in either a ministry like ours. 2 of them work with us in our Christian ministry, and then my oldest son is a church planter, pastor in Canada. And now we've got grandkids, and yours is my youngest grandchild at this point. And interestingly, she's only 2, but a very bright 2. But her favorite book to read at this point is the Bible. Yeah. And we've got some really cute videos of her in her crib reading her Bible, and she wants to read it every day. And so, of course, she's only 2. But I'm watching that 2-year-old loving to read her Bible, and already as her grandfather, I'm thinking, so how do we usher this next generation and walk with them in such a way that when they're 22, they still love reading their Bible more than anything? And so, my family, that's been my experience. And I know that that's not common. I know that certainly in most families, there's at least one prodigal child that just went a different way. To have my 2 younger kids both working for our ministry, and my older son as a pastor is unusual to have all 3 serving that way and that serious about their faith. And so I don't hold that up to say, boy, you should just parent like me. I really feel like I've kind of sat in the front row just trying to figure this out and observe what God has done. But several things I would just share in terms of observations I have about that. And one, I would just say, some of you may be listening. I know some of you that listen, your kids are already grown and they haven't all followed the Lord. And so I don't want this to be a hard one for you to even listen to. Number one, I would say don't ever give up. And some of your kids may kind of take a detour for a while. But as a parent, you've got an extra challenging call upon your life to be that person that just keeps praying them back in and doing whatever it takes. And that requires some of the highest level parenting and leadership that there is how do you lead an adult child back into the fold when they're an adult, they don't have to listen to you. That takes high level leadership, and it takes perseverance. But don't give up. And it might be that for some of you, your kids are now grown adults, and your main challenge may be your grandkids. Maybe you've got a son or daughter that's just very hardened their heart to the things of God, but your grandkids still are open-hearted, and God will show you how to redeem them and connect with them and set an example and pray for them. So a couple of things I would just share, just kind of a random list here, I guess. But one is be intentional when you're around your kids or grandkids or even just young people in your company, your organization. Always be thinking about what can I impart to them that will help them understand the culture. Don't just tell them what to do. Tell them how to do it. And, Sam, you and I have had some of those conversations, even as we've talked about Blackaby Ministries, to say, not just, okay, let's do that or let's do that, but let's talk about why we do that. Like, why do we try to work so hard with people that, for instance, if they have us come speak somewhere. I mean, why do we want to do things with excellence? Why do we try to care about the people and impart a blessing? You know, we don't just go and speak in our 30-minute slot and then get out of there. We hang around and talk to people. We minister. And why do we do that? And so, you know, be intentional to just talk with your kids about, well, why do we do it this way? It's easy just to bark out orders. It's another to address the why. You know, why is this important? Why is it I've just chosen to do this? And sometimes with kids and younger people, we can be impatient. We just want the job done. But if you don't help them understand the why, then they won't care about the what. And so a second thing is just have high expectations. Expect that your kids are going to want to love your God and serve your God. Don't be wishy-washy. I've learned one thing. If you talk kind of wishy-washy as a leader, like, well, I hope you'll do this, or I'm hoping you'll do that, then you already are sort of putting seeds of doubt in their minds. Yeah. So, you know, just say, I know you're a smart boy. I know you will want to do the right thing. I know that you will want to honor God with your life and so on. Expect that they're going to want to do that. I always just assume that about my kids. I assume the best, and then you affirm the best and you back up the best. But expect, don't go in just as some parents, I swear, go in assuming their kids are all going to rebel, and sure enough, they all do. I'd assume that they're not going to rebel. I could be disappointed. I wasn't really, but assume the best. And a third thing is help the younger generation, especially your own kids or grandkids, help them to think. Don't just bark out orders, but help them to think and encourage them to think. And, you know, one thing that we did in that regard is we surrounded our kids with books. We kind of had a standing deal with our kids that if they would read it, we would buy it. If you know, I didn't buy them 20 books and have them all sit on the shelf, but I'd buy them one book. And if they read that book, I'd buy them another book. And we spent a lot of money on books, but all three of my kids like reading. And of course, we're in a book club now. My kids are in their 30s now, and you're in the book club as well, Sam. And we're taking on some pretty heavy duty books sometimes that really stretch us. Yeah. But I tell you what, it just does my heart good every time we have book club, and I'm watching you and my kids wrestling with tough books and thought-provoking books. And you're adults now, but I'm still trying to just encourage you guys to think and to process and work through stuff, and not to be afraid of tough issues. We've read books written by avid atheists. You know, I'm not afraid of you guys reading that stuff, but then let's talk through what he says, and let's point out the fallacies, the shortcomings of his argument, where he's not consistent, and so on. So, but at an early age, don't just always tell your kids what to think. Ask them questions. Make them think. Or if they give you the answer that they think you're looking for, come back and say, well, why is that? Or why do you say that? Or where in the Bible do you find that? Or you know, you come home from church and just ask them, well, what's one thing that the pastor said today in his sermon that stood out to you? Or did you agree with everything that he said? Or, you know, or do you think he used the Bible right there? And I mean, again, don't try to train your kids to be critics of your preacher, but get them to think for themselves, and to weed out stuff that may not be biblical, or at least sometimes it's like, well, you know, he said that, but you know, to be completely fair, the Bible doesn't actually say that. He was speculating there. It might have been that way, but the Bible doesn't say that that's what happened. It's just his speculation there. And so just have a, you know, I grew up with that kind of environment where my dad would sit around the kitchen table and he would ask us questions, and we would, he'd make us think, and he'd push us. He didn't take just simple answers. And I try to do that with my kids to help them to think. And they all are great thinkers. They're all smart. I'll never forget, we were all at the beach one time in Destin, Florida, and all three of my kids, and you were in the thick of things there. And I remember, I think Daniel was probably stirring stuff up, and Mike was trying to, pontificate about what he thought. And I remember my wife Lisa getting a little concerned because there was people were kind of animated and jumping in and talking about this and that, and Lisa was like, she was just troubled that here we were on vacation and our kids were arguing, and I had to say, Lisa, they're not arguing, they're discussing. And I said, you ought to be proud. Here we are at the beach, and they're having a deep theological, philosophical discussion. I'm proud of them that they're even on vacation. They're still thinking about deep stuff, and they're talking about it and chewing on it. And I said, we've got smart kids. And so, teach your kids to think. And a fourth thing is just watch for problems. As leaders, you want the fewest number of surprises possible.
Yeah.
You don't want to be surprised. You don't want to find out one day that your child is addicted to drugs or has been sleeping around or is an atheist now. There's usually signs that would indicate that they're moving in that direction. It might happen, but you shouldn't be caught by surprise. You ought to be watching them closely enough to be able to sense danger, to sense problems. And some of the things you can watch for certainly is the friends they hang out with. When our kids were younger, like when your wife was a young girl, we regularly encouraged her to have her friends come over to our house, and we listened in. We listened to the discussions, and if her friends were wholesome and fun and respectful, they heeded the rules that we set down, then it was great. Have your friends over whenever you want. We had friends that came over almost every Sunday afternoon. But if we heard them conniving, trying to get Carrie to do stuff that she knew she wasn't supposed to do, we heard that too, and those kids didn't get invited back. We were very careful we wanted our daughter to have a good time and to have fun and have friends, but if some friend was going to try to be dishonest, underhanded, deceitful, if they played games, if they tried to turn Carrie against other friends, the little manipulative stuff sometimes little girls can sometimes do, we were on top of that early on. And I know a lot of parents that don't do that. They're not paying attention. Maybe their child doesn't want their friends coming over to their house. We tried to make our house a fun place to be. Carrie had one friend that she put in orders what she wanted for lunch when she came over. I was the chef that had certain things that she liked, but she was a good kid to have around, so we accommodated that. But then I know other parents that one day they're just shocked to discover that their kid is given up on the faith, and the sad thing sometimes is that there were all kinds of signs that there was trouble, but the parents just didn't pay attention. Carrie had one friend that she was really having a hard time. She was a sweet Christian girl, but she was having a hard time in the public school. And she kept asking her parents if she could go to a Christian school. And her parents, primarily for financial, she had nice parents, but I guess for financial reasons, they just thought it was a waste to spend that much more money on a private school. They just kind of told her to suck it up and get through. Well, it was sad because, and again, this isn't a discussion about whether you should put your kids in Christian school or not.
Yeah.
But when your child is being picked on and persecuted in school and begging you to get her out, and you don't do anything, you just tell her to just hang in there, then you shouldn't be surprised when trouble comes. And that sweet girl now is not living a Christian lifestyle, not in church anymore. She's an adult now. And it's sad because I feel like there were all kinds of warning signs that this child was experiencing trouble. And the parents, they didn't really have a solution. They just let's just try to hope she grows through this. And so as a leader in your home, when your child starts down a path away from God, away from the church, there's usually signs that that's coming. If you're asking the right questions, if you're in dialogue with them, then you don't have to be caught by surprise. You can see it coming, and you can address it early on.
Yeah, well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll wrap up when we come back. God's people keep praying for God to transform Washington, Hollywood, or Wall Street, but revival always begins with God's people. If there ever was a time America needed spiritual reawakening, it's now. Currently, 70% of churches have plateaued or are in decline. More than 2/3 of young people who grew up attending church are leaving the faith before they graduate college. In The Solomon Promise, best-selling author Henry Blackaby shares the path to a renewal of faith in America and the restoration of holiness to God's people. Order now at blackabystore.org. Links will be in the show notes. Well, Richard, in the last couple minutes we have left here, what are some nuggets of wisdom that we can take with us as parents?
Well, just a couple more last ones, Sam. Maybe just to touch on the fifth one would just be ask questions. Sometimes we do way too much talking and not enough asking.
Yeah.
If you want to know where your child is, ask them questions.
They need to talk.
Ask them. What are you reading right now? What books are you reading? Who are you listening to? Who's your music groups you're listening to? What's your favorite class at school? What have they said that's really made you think? And just kind of be listening for stuff that might be, they might be being attracted by heretical beliefs or atheistic viewpoints or worldviews. At first it just might be just kind of intriguing to them. And so, come alongside and help talk it through. And you may have to do some research yourself to find answers, but be asking questions. Another one is just set an attractive example of what the Christian life looks like. Sadly, the reason some of our kids aren't interested in Christianity is because they've watched what it looks like in their parents' life, and it's not attractive.
Yeah.
Live your life as best you can. You won't be perfect. I certainly was not perfect. But live your life in a way that has integrity, that's honest. If you mess up, admit it, apologize, strive to be better. Show your kids you're striving to be more and more like Christ year by year, and but it's worth it because you just love God and all that He's done for you. So and I tell you, there's such a burden on that. And again, it's still not foolproof. Judas lived with Jesus himself and was not convinced. Mm-hmm. So you could be just like Jesus and still lose some of your kids from the faith. But certainly that at least removes one more excuse from them. And so make the Christian life as appealing as possible. And I'll tell you, that doesn't mean you drag them to church every Sunday. That means you live like Christ in your home and around the dinner table and in the evenings. And when you have to discipline them and when you have to correct them and so on, be like Jesus then too. And two last things. One that I really would emphasize is try to surround your kids with awesome Christians. I mean, try to be an awesome Christian, but surround them with other awesome Christians. And I know when our kids were growing up, and even when I was growing up, my parents knew some amazing Christians, people that were just dynamic, that were smart, that were funny, that were really good communicators, that were really great evangelists, and they would have them in our home. And a lot of these guys, would let their hair down and they'd have corny jokes, and they would most of them tended to like to laugh and play, practical jokes, but they were awesome Christians and they loved Jesus. And we just saw what amazing people there were out there who were Christians and how cool they were and how fun they were. And that really just gave us such a good impression. Of course, there are hypocrites out there. There are people that can also turn you away. That's why whenever there's an awesome Christian, if you're a parent, invite them to your house for lunch, just for the primary reason of getting your kids around them. And when I had people like that come to my home, I would say, hey, tell my kids about what you guys do at your church or that mission trip you were on. Tell us about that, and tell us about this. And my kids would be just fascinated by some of these people. My kids, some of their biggest heroes were Christians who just were really cool. And so get your kids around that. When you travel, take them to churches on maybe vacation that are awesome, or just help them see what God's doing around the world, and let them know that Christianity is a lot more than just going to church on Sunday. There's amazing people in the kingdom of God, and expose your kids to as much of that as you can. So if there's like some awesome mission couple that's at your church, approach the pastor and say, hey, what would it take to be able to have them come and have dinner at my house? And just get your kids around them. And and by the way, if you do have them come to your house for dinner, don't just the adults do all the talking and let the kids kind of scamper off into the other room. Keep your kids at the table and engage them. Let them, don't just have the adults talk. You get your kids talking to these amazing Christians. I've seen that happen before, where all the adults chatter away and the kids kind of quietly just leave. But get your kids involved in the discussion. Let them ask questions and let them hear what's going on and at a level that they understand. And the last one, just say kind of partly tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, and that is just don't make following Jesus lame, or at least appear lame. It's that's like the worst thing that you could do. My kids have had to warn me, Dad, that's just lame. And sometimes the Christian life can appear that way to the younger generation. It's just going to boring church and listening to boring stuff. And so you may have to be very proactive. And we've talked a bit about this before, but if your church is just going through really horrific times, it might mean that for the sake of your kids, you need to get to a healthier church. I'm not one that tends to abandon ship, but I'll tell you what, it's not worth losing my kids and their faith because I was trying to hang in to a really dysfunctional church. You may need to get to a healthier youth group somewhere, at least for a time, while your kids are in an impressionable age. Sometimes it's just, I mean, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes you go to church and maybe the pastor was just off that day. The sermon wasn't that great. It was boring. The music was kind of dull. And you got to kind of rate this Sunday. I mean, you want to teach your kids to be faithful, but let's face it, that was just not the best, out of, on a scale of 1 to 10, that was not in the top 5 services you've been to. That might be the time to go through a drive-through somewhere and get their favorite food afterward. I mean, we did that at times. I mean, we literally thought we better get these guys a hamburger and ice cream today. That was a harder service, and maybe a visiting speaker that wasn't very good. So my kids are leaving church thinking, this is kind of a waste of our morning. Well, let's try to salvage that. Let's have a friend come over on Sunday afternoon. Let's go through and get some fun food. Let's do something a little funner. But we want to try to save the day and let them know Sundays and church isn't always necessarily hitting the ball out of the park every week, but we'll find a way to make Sunday and church and the Christian life still fun. Whatever we need to do. But be aware of that. Don't let your kids just go have bad experiences at church or around Christians and just leave it at that. There's a way to turn that around, salvage that if you have to. But always have the long-term view in mind. You're in the long game, and so Sunday by Sunday, week by week, it may not always be just fantastic, but be thinking about how can I bring something good from this, plant seeds that will bear fruit later. And maybe address stuff early on so that it doesn't go even more sour in my child's heart as the years go by.
Well, Richard, this has been fascinating and eye-opening, and I think it's an area that everyone in leadership and everyone in general hopes to have a kind of legacy with their family that they can be proud of, and so. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. Well, just take care of that little 2-year-old Claire of mine. I want her to be a godly young lady one day.
Definitely. Definitely. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.